sometimes antibiotics, sometimes antifungals. And then in addition, in order to manage the lymphedema, we are trying to get lymphatic flow, and we're trying to reduce any load on the lymphatics, and we mostly use yoga. We have breathing techniques which are part of the yoga, and we have manual lymphatic drainage, which we call Indian manual lymphatic drainage, which is actually also yoga. Yoga massage, and we do have some compression. But compression in India is very expensive, too expensive, and therefore we cannot rely on the kind of expert bandaging and stockings hosiery which is available in the West. But there is a big middle class in India, so we do have patients who can afford, but the majority of our patients in the villages cannot afford bandages, cannot afford stockings. So we tend to rely in them much more on these other practices like yoga. So here we see counseling, which is the same as counseling in any part of the world. We take a lot of time over it. Patients are given a choice of how to manage their system because they are committing themselves to a lifelong process, and they have to fully understand what they're being asked to do. Now in India, unlike most of the countries in which I work, there's a lot of family participation. There's a lot of community participation, so we often involve the family and the community in their management, and they are part of the education system. Volume measurement, how much water is displaced, is one of the themes, one of the ways. Measurements with tape measures as done anywhere else. And then looking for entry points, like anywhere else. The fevers that result from the cellulitis that we were hearing about earlier, the other infections which in these tropics tend to be so common, and therefore we are constantly doing a very thorough examination in order to detect entry points and then to manage them. As here, between the toes can be a very important entry point. Skin washing. We do it with lukewarm water. I'll be talking about water a little bit later in this lecture, because it has to be available. Washing is one of the basic treatments of managing recurrent infections in lymphedema. We always use some additional soaps, and we try and make them acid soaps, not alkaline, because the skin prefers an acid environment. So washing, and then topical applications if needed for the eczema, the funguses, and so on. And then, importantly, Fanta soaking. This is the Ayurveda. This is the Indian system of medicine. Because what happens in herbal remedies of Ayurveda is that they divide people into different constitutions called Kapha, Vata, and Pitta. And the language used is difficult for us in the West to understand, because it includes things like wind. You have too much wind, or you have too much heat. All sorts of terms which we don't really use them in our Western physiology. But they divide their patients up into different constitutions and give them different herbs according to the constitutions. Now these are Ayurvedic specialists who had as long a training as ourselves in the West. They go to universities, Ayurvedic universities, 6-year training, often a PhD after that, and they are very, very knowledgeable about their system, and they know a lot about herbs, and they know a lot about diagnosing different constitutions. So far, it is my practice simply to record what we are doing and not yet to ask questions how it is working. But we're very elaborately recording everything that is done, including the processes of diagnosing different constitutions and then treating them with different herbs. Some of these herbs are taken by mouth. The patients are also on special diets. So there's a huge effort in selecting the Ayurvedic medications, mostly based on herbs, many of which can be grown in their own villages. Then there is the whole story of yoga. 2 sessions a day, lasting 30 to 40 minutes. That's a long time. And they are done very carefully with breathing coordination, and they're done before they have compression and then again after compression. In other words, any bandages that we do put on, they have done yoga before we put them on, and then they do it again when we have the bandages and the stockings on. And yoga is second nature in Indian. We can get Indians to do that. I went to a very big conference on yoga last year, 2,000 people all doing yoga at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was one person, myself, not doing yoga, because I cannot even touch my toes. So I did not demonstrate my failures. But doing yoga is second nature to many people in the Indian villages, and it costs nothing. It's all self-help. And this coordination of breathing with everything they do, every movement they do, the waggling of the ankles, the raising of the legs, the various movements side to side, touching their toes and so on, all those movements are coordinated with breathing, particularly expiratory breathing, the breathing out, in and then very slowly breathing out, coordinated with movement. It's a very major part of Indian systems of medicine. Each treatment is cheap, easily provided after brief training, culturally sensitive, and capable of widespread compliance. This is a chap in his home doing his yoga exercises. They're helped by other members of the family. I'll come back to them in a moment. And they're also helped by even members of the community. So here we are, the different sort of exercises. In this case, he's got his bandages on, and this is the second phase of the yoga. He will have already had one session of yoga without the bandages. And then there's massage. The massage is done by people in our clinic, and then by family members or even community members. Massage works in several ways, but as I showed you, the lymphatic system is in various parts. There is the part that is immediately under the epidermis, which responds to very, very superficial movement. And then there is the deeper element in which you really squeeze and try and bring the fluid up to the level in which it can exit in the initial lymphatics. And although this isn't written into yoga, and when I went to this big conference on yoga with the expert gurus, a man called Ramdev, who you can see on your television at 5 o'clock in the morning if you tune into internationally to yoga, he hadn't realized, and yoga does not realize, how important yoga is for the lymphatic system. On the other hand, I didn't realize how important yoga is for the nervous system and the way the nervous system has an effect on the contractility of the lymphatics. So we're teaching ourselves, each other, new knowledge about yoga. So here we have Indian lymph drainage. They've had their herbal soaks. Oh, I missed that, but that was brother. Yes, please. Sorry about that. Previous, yes. And the one before, and before. Doesn't like it. That's it. Treatment methods will fit any environment, whether academic medical center or remote village. And in those remote villages, you will find brother and sister and mother and uncle and aunt, all willing to participate. When I go to China, it's quite a different story. One-child families in China do not produce a family which is going to help you with your lymphedema. But in India, in the villages, it's quite a different story. Then we do have bandaging. But as I say, it's not affordable. And therefore, we rely very much on gifts from the various manufacturers of bandages. For instance, next door, Haddenham is a new producer of bandages and hosiery. And very often patients are measured, the stockings go to them, and they immediately find they're not quite fitting, so they return them back. And what do you do with them? Well, I'm encouraging those that are returned because they're not well fitted to be sent to India. We do use foams to fill up the gaps and to try and produce a rounded limb, because the rounded limb responds better to all therapies. But that's expensive too, and therefore we're looking at ways of production of these sort of materials in India. Then we end up with bandages. In the West, in our countries, short stretch bandages, ones which are not very extensive,